Imagine being denied your rightful seat in first class, not because of any mistake or misconduct, but because of the color of your skin. On a seemingly ordinary flight from San Francisco to New York, Adrian Cole, a composed and powerful black CEO, faces exactly the humiliating reality. Surrounded by suspicion, accused as a security risk, he is subjected to public scrutiny and overt discrimination right at the gate. But Adrian doesn't react with anger or outburst. Instead, he chooses silence and quiet strength, a resilience forged by years of experience and inner resolve. What happens when the very system, designed to protect us, turns against its creator? How far can one man's calm resistance shake an institution rooted in bias? And when the entire airport's digital security network freezes at his command, is it a moment of chaos or justice? This story isn't just about one man's fight. It's a mirror reflecting the silent prejudices many face every day. Every who really controls the power in the skies. And how can true justice ever take flight? If you're ready to hear a story that will challenge your assumptions and move your heart, hit like, share with those who need to hear this, and subscribe to Silent Defenders. Now, let's dive into Adrienne's journey. The boarding area at Gate C12 buzzed with a familiar kind of energy. Conversations overlapped. The metallic clack of rolling luggage echoed across the tile, and the occasional boarding announcement crackled through the overhead speakers. Beyond the glass, the afternoon sun hit the fuselage of the skyward Atlantic Airways A350, its paint shimmering in gold and white under the California sky. Passengers clutching their carry-ons and coffee cups shuffled in loose lines toward the gate podium. Adrian Cole stood a few steps back from the first-class boarding lane, his boarding pass already displayed on his phone. He wasn't in a hurry. The flight to New York would be 5.5 hours. He always noticed. 2 more passengers scanned in, greeted, and stepped onto the jet bridge. Adrian stepped up to the podium, phone extended toward the gate agent. "Good afternoon, sir," the agent said with a neutral smile. She scanned his boarding pass. The scanner gave a crisp, approving chime, and his seat number appeared on the screen. "Tua, thank you," Adrian said, reaching for his phone, but the agent's eyes narrowed. She glanced at her monitor again, then hesitated. The smile slipped. "One moment. Please," she murmured. A small pause, barely 5 seconds, but in boarding time, it was an eternity. The passengers behind Adrian shifted, impatient. The agent tapped at her keyboard, frowned, and glanced toward the jet bridge. Samantha Blake had stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "Everything all right?" Adrian asked, his tone polite, even. The agent's voice was careful. "I just need to confirm something with the crew." Samantha appeared beside the podium, leaning in just enough for her voice to carry. "Let me see his pass." The agent handed over the scanner. Samantha's eyes moved from the screen to Adrian, then back again. "Manual verification," she said flatly, almost to herself. "I'll take it from here." It was the first twinge of recognition, not of who he was, but of what was about to unfold. Adrian had been here before, not at this gate, not with his crew, but in this moment, the sudden shift from routine to scrutiny, the pivot from invisible passenger to potential problem. "Is there an issue?" he asked, his voice still calm. Samantha's answer was short. "We just need to confirm your seat." "Sir, please step to the side." A few passengers looked up from their phones. 1 or 2 leaned slightly to see better. Adrian stepped aside, his mind ticking quietly. He had been flagged manually, not by the system. His system didn't flag without cause. This was human discretion, the kind that often came laced with assumption. Samantha kept her voice low, but her body language spoke volumes. Control, authority, and something sharper beneath. "It'll only take a minute," she said, though her eyes didn't match her words. The agent at the podium avoided looking at him now, focusing on the next passenger. A man in a pale blue sport coat breezed through without pause. The scanner beeped. The agent smiled, and he walked down the jet bridge without a glance at Adrian. Adrienne's hands rested lightly on his briefcase handle. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest. not of fear, but of something deeper, the knowledge that dignity is a choice, even under inspection. He had the tools to dismantle this before it went any further. But he also knew the value of seeing the full picture before making a move. Samantha's radio crackled. "Cabin check complete," a voice said. She didn't respond. She was still looking at him. A little girl in line tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Why is he not allowed to get on?" she whispered. Not quite quietly enough. Her mother hushed her, glancing around as though the question itself were dangerous. Adrian allowed a slow breath. He had learned to measure moments like this to know when to step in, when to hold back, and when to simply observe. He was about to board a flight across the country, but it felt as if something far larger had already taken off. The agent gestured toward him again. "You can go ahead, sir," she said finally as if nothing had happened, but Adrian knew better. Something had happened, and something else was coming. He stepped onto the jet bridge, the hum of the air system, filling his ears ahead. The doorway to the plane framed Samantha's figure as she waited, her tablet in one hand. Passengers ahead of him disappeared into the cabin, their voices fading. His steps were steady. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and recycled air. At the threshold, Samantha gave him a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. Samantha kept her voice low, but her body language spoke volumes. Control, authority, and something sharper beneath. "It'll only take a minute," she said, though her eyes didn't match her words. The agent at the podium avoided looking at him now, focusing on the next passenger. A man in a pale blue sport coat breezed through without pause. The scanner beeped. The agent smiled, and he walked down the jet bridge without a glance at Adrian. Adrian's hands rested lightly on his briefcase handle. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not of fear, but of something deeper, the knowledge that dignity is a choice, even under inspection. He had the tools to dismantle this before it went any further. But he also knew the value of seeing the full picture before making a move. Samantha's radio crackled. "Cabin check complete," a voice said. She didn't respond. She was still looking at him. A little girl in line tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Why is he not allowed to get on?" she whispered. Not quite quietly enough. Her mother hushed her, glancing around as though the question itself were dangerous. Adrian allowed a slow breath. He had learned to measure moments like this to know when to step in, when to hold back, and when to simply observe. He was about to board a flight across the country, but it felt as if something far larger had already taken off. The agent gestured toward him again. "You can go ahead, sir," she said finally as if nothing had happened, but Adrian knew better. Something had happened, and something else was coming. He stepped onto the jet bridge, the hum of the air system, filling his ears ahead. The doorway to the plane framed Samantha's figure as she waited, her tablet in one hand. Passengers ahead of him disappeared into the cabin, their voices fading. His steps were steady. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and recycled air. At the threshold, Samantha gave him a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Right this way, Mr. Cole." It was the first time she had used his name, and the way she said it told him she still didn't know who he really was. The cabin air was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of coffee and leather from the first-class section. The muted hum of the engines vibrated underfoot as boarding continued in slow, steady waves. Adrian stepped into the aisle, his briefcase in one hand, phone in the other. His eyes took in the details out of habit, the spacing of the seats, the gleam of the seat belt buckles, the arrangement of crew moving in practiced rhythm. Seat 2A was by the window, already prepared with a folded blanket and a glass of water on the armrest. A passenger in 1B, a silver-haired man in a navy suit, looked up briefly as Adrian passed, his expression politely neutral before he returned to his tablet. Across the aisle, a young woman scrolled on her phone, oblivious to the world around her. Samantha Blake followed Adrian into the cabin, the sharp click of her heels on the carpet barely audible over the murmur of boarding. She moved with the efficiency of someone who knew the space like her own home. But there was something else in her stride, attention that had nothing to do with service and everything to do with scrutiny. Adrian placed his briefcase in the overhead bin, sliding it in neatly. As he sat, Samantha lingered a few steps away, her tablet in hand. She glanced down at it, then at him, then back again. It wasn't the casual check-in of a crew member ensuring passenger comfort. It was assessment calculation. Her eyes met his briefly. "Mr. Cole," she said, her tone smooth but clipped. "I'll need to verify something with the purser before we depart. Shouldn't take long." He nodded once. Of course, on the surface, it was nothing a crew member doing her job. But Adrian knew the layers. The AeroShield Sentinel network didn't require manual verification for passengers already cleared at the gate. That meant someone had entered a manual flag into the system. And it hadn't been for the passenger in 1B, or the woman across the aisle, or the man in 3C, now settling in with a newspaper. Adrienne's gaze drifted out the window as a catering truck rolled away from the aircraft. In the reflection of the glass, he caught Samantha speaking quietly to a tall man in the galley. Paul Renshaw, the onboard security supervisor. His posture was rigid, his expression faintly skeptical as he looked toward Adrienne's seat. They spoke for less than 10 seconds, but it was enough. Paul disappeared toward the rear of the plane, leaving Samantha standing in the galley entrance, eyes narrowing slightly. As she scrolled her tablet, Adrienne's fingers rested on the armrest. He wasn't angry yet. Anger was a spark, and he had learned to save his fire for what would burn brightest. What he felt instead was a deep, familiar weight pressing against his chest, the knowledge that this wasn't about him as an individual. It was about the story people thought they saw when they looked at him. The boarding process dragged on. Passengers filed past, some glancing curiously at Adrian as they found their seats. A few cast longer looks, perhaps drawn by the subtle standoff between him and the flight attendant, who seemed to keep orbiting his row. A soft voice pulled his attention. "Excuse me," said a woman. Across the aisle, she was in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm presence. "I couldn't help but notice they seemed unsure about your seat." Adrian offered a small smile. "It happens sometimes." She hesitated. "I travel a lot. I've never seen them double-check a first-class passenger like that." He simply nodded. There was no point in unpacking the truth for a stranger. "Not yet." Samantha returned, leaning slightly toward Adrienne's seat. "Mr. Cole, may I see your boarding pass again?" He passed her his phone without comment. She scanned it with a portable reader. The device beeped, and a message appeared that Adrian could see reflected in her glasses. "Cleared seat 2-way." She tapped the screen anyway, her fingers entering a code. "Thank you," she said, handing it back. Her smile was professional, but it felt like a formality layered over suspicion. Adrian placed his phone on the tray table. His mind was running parallel tracks, one following the boarding process, the other reconstructing the digital footprint of her actions. Every manual input left a trail, and on a system he had designed. Those trails led somewhere. 2 more passengers settled in nearby. The aisle became crowded with last-minute boarders stowing bags and shuffling to their seats. Overhead bins clicked shut. The purser announced final boarding. Somewhere behind him, a child laughed. The sound was a brief welcome crack in the tension. As the boarding door closed, Samantha walked the aisle, checking seat belts and overhead bins. She stopped at Adrienne's row again. Her voice pitched low, but carrying just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We'll be taking off shortly. Please remain seated, and if any issues come up, I'll need you to follow my instructions." It was framed as a standard announcement, but Adrian caught the emphasis, the quiet undercurrent of warning. Not to the cabin, to him. He held her gaze for a moment before answering. "I always do." Her eyes narrowed just slightly before she moved on. A man in 3A shifted uncomfortably, sensing something he couldn't name. As the safety video began to play, Adrian leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. He felt the rhythm of the cabin, the crew's movements, the passengers settling, the subtle shifts in tone. He remembered a time years earlier when an incident like this would have provoked an immediate response from him. Now he understood the power of waiting, of letting the story reveal itself fully before turning the page. The plane began to push back from the gate. Engines rumbled to life, a deep vibration rolling through the floor. Adrian opened his eyes and looked down the aisle. Samantha stood near the galley again, speaking quietly into her radio. Paul Renshaw reappeared, moving forward with a slow, deliberate pace, as if making his way toward Adrienne's row. Outside the window, the runway lights stretched into the distance, guiding the aircraft toward its place in line for departure. Inside, another kind of runway was forming one lined with suspicion, bias, and an approaching confrontation. Adrian adjusted the cuff of his shirt and rested his hand lightly on the phone end. His lap, whatever was coming, he was ready to meet it. The aircraft had begun its slow taxi toward the runway when Adrian noticed Paul Renshaw making his way down the aisle. His steps were measured, his face set in a kind of practiced seriousness. He stopped 2 rows short of Adrian, leaning slightly toward Samantha Blake, who stood in the galley with her tablet pressed against her arm. Their conversation was low, but Adrian could read the cues in their body language. Paul's brow furrowed. Samantha's lips tightened, her chin lifted slightly as, if bracing herself, Paul stepped forward. He was a tall man with close-cropped hair and the solid build of someone used to being obeyed. He stopped beside Adrian's seat, holding on to the headrest of 2B for balance as the plane rolled forward. The hum of the engines filled the pause before he spoke. "Mr. Cole," Paul said evenly, "I'm going to need you to stand and come with me to the galley." Adrienne's head turned slowly. "Is there a problem?" Paul's voice carried enough to draw glances from nearby passengers. "Your boarding pass was flagged for a security review. We need to conduct that review now." Adrienne's eyes narrowed just slightly. "We're taxiing for takeoff." "That's correct," Paul said. "And this can't wait." A murmur rippled through the first-class cabin. The man in 1B shifted uncomfortably. The woman across the aisle stopped scrolling her phone and looked up. A child a few rows back whispered to her, "Father, what's happening?" Adrian took a slow breath. "I've already been scanned at the gate. My seat was confirmed." Paul's expression didn't change. "We have discretion to conduct additional checks if we deem it necessary." That single word carried the weight of authority and the ease with which it could be abused. Samantha stepped closer, her presence sharp in the narrow space. "Mr. Cole, it's a simple process. We'll need you to remove your jacket, empty your pockets, and follow us." The way she said "follow us" made it sound like a command reserved for troublemakers, not paying customers. Adrian stayed seated, his voice calm but edged with steel. "And on what basis? Are you deeming this necessary?" Samantha's smile was thin. "Standard protocol. Standard protocol," Adrian repeated as if tasting the words. Paul's eyes darted briefly to Samantha before returning to Adrian. "Sir, if you refuse, we'll have to notify the captain. That could result in removing you from a flight." The tension thickened. Adrian could feel the eyes of half the cabin on him now. This was no longer just a conversation. It was a scene. He had seen these moments before. Moments that begin with an assumption and end with a headline. He unfastened his seat belt with a quiet click and stood. The movement was deliberate, unhurried. He slid his jacket off his shoulders and folded it neatly over his arm. "Let's not keep the captain waiting," he said. Samantha stepped back, gesturing toward the galley as if leading a parade. Paul followed closely behind Adrian, a silent shadow ensuring compliance. As they reached the galley, Samantha pointed to the narrow space beside the beverage cart. "Here will do." Adrian set his jacket on the counter, his briefcase beside it. He stood with his shoulders square, his eyes steady. "Empty your pockets, please," Samantha said. He removed his phone, wallet, and a small leather card holder, placing them in a shallow bin she provided. The phone's dark screen reflected the overhead lights, its glass surface smooth and unassuming. "Arms out," Paul instructed. Adrian extended his arms. Samantha began a pat-down, her hands firm, moving over his torso, down his sides, along his legs. The contact was impersonal but invasive. Each motion exaggerated, just enough to signal to anyone watching that this was more than a routine check. The engines hummed louder as the plane joined the line for takeoff. A few passengers craned their necks to watch. One man in row 4 whispered to his seatmate, "Must have done something." Adrian kept his face composed, but inside his mind was a controlled fire. He knew the Sentinel Network's logs would show every action taken against his boarding record, and he knew that in this moment, in this confined space with its low ceiling and hum of machinery, Samantha and Paul believed they were in control. When the paton ended, Samantha nodded to Paul. "Check his phone." Paul picked it up, turning it over in his hand. Passcode. Adrian's voice was quiet. "You're not authorized to access my device." Paul hesitated, then placed the phone back in the bin. "Fine." Samantha's gaze flicked to the device, then to Adrian. "You're clear," she said, though the words landed with a reluctance that made them feel hollow. Adrian gathered his belongings. Slipping the phone into his jacket pocket, he looked at Samantha, his voice low enough for only her and Paul to hear. "You just logged a manual security override on a system I designed. I hope you're ready to explain that." Samantha's jaw tightened. For the first time, she didn't have a ready answer. Adrian stepped past them, walking back to his seat with the same calm pace he had used to stand. As he sat, he noticed the woman across the aisle watching him with quiet concern. He offered a brief nod, and she returned it. The seatbelt sign remained on as the plane inched closer to the runway. Outside the window, the late afternoon light stretched long shadows across the tarmac. Inside, the atmosphere in first class was taut, the unspoken question hanging in the recycled air. What had just happened? Adrian leaned back, his mind already working. The Aero Shield Sentinel Network was built to protect against threats external, internal, and systemic. But today, it had been manipulated from within by people who had no idea who they were dealing with. He could feel the edges of the plan forming, the steps that would follow. Not yet, not here, but soon. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're number 34. Departure. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened." The engines roared as the plane turned onto the runway. Adrian glanced at Samantha in the galley, her posture crisp, her eyes fixed ahead. Paul stood nearby, his expression neutral, but there was a flicker of uncertainty there. Now the plane began its acceleration, the cabin pressing gently back against the passengers. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, not to rest, but to focus. The opening moves had been made. Now, it was his turn to decide how the rest of the game would play out. The aircraft lifted from the runway with a deep, steady roar, pressing passengers back into their seats. San Francisco's skyline tilted away beyond the window, sunlight flashing across the bay. Inside, the cabin settled into a fragile stillness. The sound of the engines filled the air, a constant backdrop to the silence that had fallen over first class. Adrian sat with his hands resting lightly on his knees. He had learned long ago how to appear completely still while his mind was working at full speed. Every second of that encounter in the galley replayed in his head with absolute clarity. Samantha's calculated pauses, Paul's insistence on authority, the way the cabin seemed to hold its breath when he stood. The woman across the aisle spoke first, her voice a careful whisper. "I saw the way she looked at you," she said, glancing toward the galley. "That wasn't procedure." Adrian gave a small, polite smile. "You travel often?" "Twice a month," she replied. "I've been in first class for 15 years. That wasn't procedure." Her words landed in a way she probably didn't expect. It wasn't just validation. It was confirmation that he wasn't imagining it, that what had unfolded wasn't invisible to the people around him. From a few rows back, a young man leaned forward, speaking just loud enough for Adrian to hear. "Mun, I've been flying since I was a kid. Never seen them pat down somebody after boarding." Adrian didn't answer. He didn't need to. Sometimes silence spoke more than words. Samantha walked through the cabin again, her posture impeccable, her smile clipped and professional. To anyone who hadn't seen the exchange earlier, she might have looked like a model of customer service. But to those who had, every move she made seemed rehearsed, defensive. She passed Adrienne's seat without making eye contact. The engines hummed as the aircraft climbed through a bank of thin clouds. The sunlight softened, casting a pale glow over the cabin. Adrian turned his gaze to the oval window. The world below reduced to a blur of land and water. A memory surfaced the first time he had been stopped at an airport for random screening. He was 24, carrying a borrowed laptop and a head full of ambition. Back then, the indignity had burned hot in his chest, an ache that lasted for days. Years later, he had built the AROS Shield Sentinel network in part to eliminate that randomness, to make security smarter, more precise, less prone to the bias of human discretion. And yet, here he was caught in the exact trap he had tried to dismantle. He could feel the conflict rising in him. A part of him wanted to act now to make the call, pull the data, expose what had just happened before they even reached cruising altitude. Another part urged patience. The most decisive moves were often made after the opponent thought the game was over. The seatbelt sign switched off with a soft chime. A flight attendant began taking drink orders. The silver-haired man in 1B asked for sparkling water. The woman across the aisle ordered coffee. When it was Adrienne's turn, he kept it simple. Water, please. His voice was calm, but inside a storm tightened. It wasn't just about him. He knew there were people somewhere, watching this exact kind of thing happen, and assuming they had no recourse. That thought settled heavily on him, the weight of responsibility pressing down in the quiet hum of the cabin. As the attendant returned with his drink, Adrienne's phone vibrated once in his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen. The notification was from a secure AROS Shield channel, a system alert showing a manual security override tagged to his passenger record. The log included a timestamp and the initials SB, Samantha Blake. He stared at the screen for a moment, then locked it. His thumb rested against the edge of the device, the familiar coolness of the glass grounding him. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was evidence from a galley. Samantha's voice floated forward, speaking quietly into her radio. Paul appeared again, moving with the same deliberate pace. But this time he stopped near row 3, leaning down to speak with a passenger. Whatever they were discussing, it didn't involve Adrian, at least not directly. But Adrian watched the way Paul's gaze slid toward him when he thought it wouldn't be noticed. The quiet in Adrian's head began to shift. The initial heat of the encounter cooled into something more dangerous. Focus. He could feel the plan taking shape, the precision of it. It wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be rushed, but when it came, it would change the trajectory of this flight. A movement at his elbow drew his attention. The woman across the aisle leaned slightly toward him. "You're taking this a lot calmer than I would," she said softly. Adrienne's eyes met hers. Calm isn't the same as passive. Her brow furrowed as if she wanted to ask more, but she nodded instead. "Well, I hope whatever you're planning works." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The plane leveled off, the seatbelt sign switching on briefly as they passed through a patch of light turbulence. Drinks rattled in their cups. Adrian steadied his glass with one hand, his gaze fixed on the forward galley. Samantha was there again, speaking to a younger crew member. She glanced toward Adrian's seat, then away quickly. That glance told him more than her words ever could. She knew on some level that she had crossed the line, but she also believed the cabin was her domain, her authority absolute from boarding to landing. Adrian took a slow sip of water. She had no idea that her authority was already slipping. In his mind, he pictured the steps ahead. One secure call, one connection to the right contact at Skyward Atlantic's Corporate Operations Center. The system would light up with alerts, questions, and then orders. And by the time this plane landed in New York, this quiet cabin would be a different place entirely. But not yet. The flight attendant returned to collect glasses. Adrian handed his over with a polite thank you. His voice was steady, his posture relaxed. To the casual observer, he might have looked like any other traveler passing the hours between coasts. Inside the quiet, storm was building, and when it broke, it would not be whether the crew had seen before. Cruising altitude brought a deceptive calm. The cabin lights softened, a warm glow reflecting off the polished surfaces. The hum of the engines was steady, the kind of background sound that could lull an untroubled mind into forgetting the world. But Adrienne's mind wasn't untroubled. It was sharpening. He waited until Samantha was at the far end of the cabin. Engaged in a conversation with a passenger in 5, Paul was nowhere in sight, likely stationed in the rear galley, giving himself the illusion of oversight without having to be in the same space as the man he just searched. Adrian reached into his jacket and slid his phone onto his lap, shielding the screen from casual view. A soft press of his thumb unlocked it, revealing the familiar encrypted interface of the Aero Shield Sentinel network. He navigated quickly, his fingers moving with the precision of someone who knew exactly where each command lived. He opened the incident log for Flight 214. The manual security override was right there, time-stamped, tagged with the initials SB. A single swipe brought up the live operations panel. From here, he could do more than just review. He could set in motion a chain of alerts that would rise far above Samantha Blake's pay grade, straight to the operations director at Skyward Atlantic headquarters in New York. Adrian hesitated, his thumb hovering over the command, not out of uncertainty, but timing. If he moved too soon, Samantha might adapt. If he waited too long, the opportunity for precision would fade. This wasn't just about responding. It was about ensuring that when the counterstroke landed, it would leave no room for denial. He tapped the command. A silent confirmation flashed across the screen. Escalation level 3, priority corporate oversight. The system began its work, routing the incident data through secure channels, flagging it for review by the airline's compliance division, legal department, and the CEO's office. Within minutes, the request for additional context would come back down the chain, and the crew would feel it. Adrian locked the phone and slipped it back into his jacket. His face gave away. Nothing. He leaned back slightly as though settling in for the long flight and looked out the window at the blanket of clouds below. It started subtly. Samantha returned from row 5, her tablet in hand, only to pause mid-step as the screen lit with a notification. She frowned and tapped it, her pace slowing. She glanced toward the forward galley, then at Adrienne's row, before continuing on with a stiffness that hadn't been there before. A few minutes later, Paul emerged from the rear of the cabin, speaking quietly into his earpiece. His eyes swept the cabin like a searchlight, landing on Adrian for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. He walked to the forward galley and joined Samantha, their heads close together over the tablet, even from his seat. Adrian could read the shift in their posture, the straightening of backs, the nervous tapping of fingers against plastic. They were no longer entirely in control. The woman across the aisle noticed, too. "Something's going on," she murmured. Adrian offered a neutral smile. Sometimes information travels faster than people expect. She looked at him curiously, but didn't press. The cabin service continued, but there was a change in rhythm. Samantha's tone with passengers was just a shade too tight, her smile a fraction too brief. Paul moved through the aisle more often now, as if to remind everyone of his presence, though his glances toward Adrian had taken on a questioning edge. Adrian sipped his water slowly, letting the moment breathe. He wasn't in a hurry. The system would do its work, gathering more than just the manual override log. It would pull every relevant frame of security footage from boarding, every audio snippet from the gate communications, every passenger manifest. Cross-check. By the time the plane landed, the record would be undeniable. From the forward galley, the interphone rang. Samantha answered, listening for several seconds before her brow furrowed deeper. She glanced at Paul, then back toward the phone, speaking in a low, rapid tone. Paul's jaw tightened. Adrian didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening. Someone in operations had seen the log entry and wanted an explanation now. And the kind of explanation Samantha could offer wouldn't hold up against the data already moving through the network. She ended the call and walked the aisle, but her stride lacked the easy authority it had earlier. When she reached Adrienne's row, she paused just long enough to speak, her voice low and almost clipped. "Mr. Cole, everything satisfactory?" The question was a strange mix of formality and unease. Adrian met her eyes for the moment, her lips pressed together. She gave a short nod and moved on, but he could feel the tension trailing in her wake. The silver-haired man in 1B leaned slightly toward Adrian once she was out of earshot. "You have some pull with this airline, don't you?" Adrian smiled faintly. "Let's just say I know how their systems work." The man chuckled quietly, then leaned back, but Adrian caught the glint of curiosity in his eyes. The hours stretched ahead, the steady rhythm of flight wrapping the cabin in a deceptive calm again. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, not to rest, but to visualize the unfolding scenario. By now, the escalation would have reached at least 2 vice presidents in New York. They would be reviewing the passenger manifest, noting his name, and connecting it with past corporate interactions. The moment they realized who he was and that he had been flagged as a security risk without cause, the calls would multiply. Somewhere behind him, a baby cried softly. The sound grounded him in the human reality of the space. For all the systems and procedures, this was still a place full of people, each with their own journey, their own expectations of safety and dignity. That was the part that mattered, not the technical victory, the principle. Another hour passed. Adrian stayed still, but his presence had become a quiet gravitational pull in the cabin. He saw in the way Paul's steps hesitated near his row, in a way Samantha avoided lingering too close. The balance had shifted, and they could feel it, even if they didn't yet understand why. The next call from operations would likely come with instructions, and those instructions would not favor the crew. Adrian glanced out the window again. The clouds had broken, revealing the patterned quilt of land below, rivers catching the sunlight like silver threads. It was a reminder perspective, always changed when you rose above. He settled deeper into his seat, his mind calm but alert. The first move had been made. The second was coming, and when it did, there would be no mistaking who truly had control of this flight. The cabin had settled into that mid-flight rhythm, the soft murmur of conversations, the quiet clink of glassware, the occasional shuffle of someone stretching their legs. But for Adrian, the stillness was only on the surface. He knew the next phase was coming. The escalation he'd triggered wouldn't stop in an inbox. It would climb the ladder until it reached someone who understood exactly what had just happened. From the forward galley, the interphone rang again. Samantha was closest, and though she moved quickly to answer, Adrian noticed the slight hesitation in her step, as if she already knew the voice on the other end wouldn't be delivering good news. She listened for several seconds, nodding, her eyes narrowing. "Yes, he's still on board," she said, her tone clipped. Then she glanced toward Adrian's seat, her gaze lingering a beat too long before she turned her back. Paul emerged from the rear, catching her eye. "What is it?" he asked under his breath. Samantha pressed the handset against her chest. "Ops wants to speak to you now." Paul took the phone, his posture stiff. "Renshaw," he said into the receiver. He listened, and with each passing moment, his expression changed. The authority in his stance seemed to drain away, replaced by something closer to caution. His eyes flicked toward Adrian. "Understood," he said finally, and handed the handset back. Adrian didn't need to hear the words to know. They had just been told who he was. The air in the cabin shifted. It was subtle, an invisible ripple moving outward from the galley, but Adrian could feel it. Samantha avoided looking at him entirely now, her focus on adjusting a stack of service trays that were already perfectly aligned. Paul remained near, the front as though guarding a space that was no longer fully his to control. A few minutes later, the captain's voice came over the PA, calm, but unusually formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Lawson. We're cruising at 37,000 feet, and we expect smooth conditions for the remainder of the flight. I'd like to remind everyone that our priority is your safety and comfort if you have any concerns. Please don't hesitate to share them with our crew." It was a standard message on the surface, but to Adrian, it was a signal. The captain had been looped in, and when a captain knew, there was a corporate escalation in progress. Every word became a carefully measured choice. The woman across the aisle leaned toward him again. "They look different," she whispered. Adrian gave a small nod. They know more than they did an hour ago. Her brows knit. About you? About what they've done, he said from the corner of his vision. Adrian caught Samantha glancing his way. Her expression was unreadable, but the stiffness in her shoulders told the story. This wasn't going to be handled quietly, in a back office after landing. Whatever conversation she just had, it had made that clear. The interphone rang a third time. Samantha answered quickly, listening without interrupting. "Yes, Captain," she said finally, she said. Then she stepped toward Adrienne's row, her smile pulled tight, her voice carefully neutral. "Mr. Cole, the captain would like to speak with you privately. If you're comfortable, we can arrange it now." Adrienne considered her for a long moment before standing. "Lead the way." They moved toward the flight deck. Paul trailed a few steps behind, though less like an escort now and more like someone who didn't want to be left out of the loop. Samantha knocked lightly on the reinforced door. It opened just wide enough for Adrian to slip inside. Captain Reed Lawson sat in his chair, headset resting around his neck. He turned slightly to face Adrian. "Mr. Cole, I understand there's been some irregularities in how you were treated before takeoff." Adrian remained standing. That's one way to put it. The captain's eyes held his. "I've been informed you're affiliated with the Aero Shield Sentinel Network." Adrienne's tone was even. "I built it." Lawson exhaled slowly. "Then I suspect you already know that your presence on this flight is now of interest to several departments at our headquarters." Adrian didn't look away. "What I know is that a manual override was filed against my record without cause. That override could have delayed this flight, compromised your manifest, and violated federal guidelines." The captain's jaw tightened. "And you have documentation of this?" "I have everything," Adrian said for a moment. The cockpit was silent except for the faint hum of instruments. Then Lawson nodded. "I'll make sure we avoid further missteps before we reach New York. You'll have my cooperation." "That's noted," Adrian replied and stepped back into the cabin. Samantha was waiting, her posture still rigid. Paul avoided his gaze entirely. As Adrian walked back to his seat, the woman across the aisle tilted her head in silent question. He offered a small smile, the kind that said patience. An hour later, the cabin crew began preparing for meal service. This time, there was no hesitation when they reached Adrienne's row. The tray in front of him was set with careful precision, his drink refilled before he even asked. It was a performance, but one with a nervous edge. Midway through the service, Adrienne's phone buzzed again. Another secure notification. This one carried a simple message from the Aero Shield network. HQ acknowledged. Expect contact upon landing. The meaning was clear. The process was already in motion, and there would be consequences. Paul passed by on his way to the rear, his eyes lingering on Adrienne's phone before he looked away. The tension was thick enough to taste now. Samantha moved with the same professional grace as before, but her voice lacked its earlier authority. She was no longer the gatekeeper of this space. She knew it, and Adrian knew it. The rest of the flight stretched ahead, but the balance of power had shifted completely. Adrian could feel the quiet watchfulness of nearby passengers, the way they glanced between him and the crew. Wordless speculation filled the gaps in conversation. Something had happened here, and it wasn't over. He leaned back, letting the hum of the engines settle into the background. The first half of the game was done. The second half, the part where accountability took shape, would begin the moment the wheels touched the runway at JFK. For now, he would wait. Waiting was its own kind of power. The hum of the engines was steady, almost hypnotic, but Adrienne's mind remained alert. He knew the real reckoning wouldn't come until the wheels touched down in New York. For now, the crew's unease was a silent companion in the cabin, a reminder that the balance of power had shifted. A quiet voice from the row behind him broke through his thoughts. "Mr." Uncle Adrian turned slightly. The woman leaning forward was in her late 40s, dressed in a dark blazer over a crisp blouse, her hair pulled back neatly. She had the composed air of someone used to asking precise questions and expecting precise answers. "I'm Dana Whitaker," she said, offering a small card across the seat gap. "Civil Rights Division, Department of Justice." Adrian glanced at the card before meeting her eyes. I take it you've been watching. I have, Dana replied. From boarding until now, and I heard enough at the gate to know the override on your profile wasn't random. Her voice was low, pitched, so only he could hear over the drone of the flight. There was no judgment in her tone, only the clarity of someone trained to separate facts from noise. What do you want to do with that information? Adrian asked. I'd like to document it, she said. With your permission, if what I think is happening is actually happening, it falls into a pattern we've been tracking for years. Different airlines, different cities, same justifications, random selection, security flag, always the same demographics. Adrian studied her face. She wasn't here to offer sympathy. She was here to build a case. And that made her valuable. You'll have what you need, he said. But not just yet, Dana tilted her head. You're playing the long game. I found it's the only game worth playing, Adrian replied. The conversation paused as Samantha moved down the aisle, collecting trays from passengers who had finished their meals. Her expression was neutral, but there was a quick, darting glance toward Dana as she passed, as if she sensed an alignment forming that she couldn't quite define. Once Samantha was gone, Dana leaned in again. You know, when I boarded, I thought I'd just have a quiet flight to New York. Then I saw Paul intercept you in the jet bridge. The way you stepped back just slightly told me you'd been through it before. Adrian gave a faint smile. You noticed details. It's my job, Dana said simply. He could see the outline of her work laptop in the bag by her feet. Her fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, not with impatience, but with calculation. She was thinking 3 steps ahead, just as he was from the forward galley. Paul's voice drifted back, low but urgent. Adrian caught fragments. Corporate protocol, documentation. Every word confirmed that the escalation was still active, still climbing. A baby's cry rose briefly from economy, then quieted. The sound was a reminder of the normal life happening around them. The people for whom this was just another cross-country trip. For them, the politics of seating and security were distant concerns. For Adrian, it was the battlefield. Dana leaned back slightly, her voice still low. When we land, you can be met by someone from corporate. I can guarantee it. They won't be expecting me. Adrienne's mind turned over the possibilities. Having her, there would change the tone of that meeting entirely. It wouldn't just be a conversation about one passenger's complaint. It would be an official matter, something that could trigger audits, reports, even hearings. You'll stay close when we deplane, he said. I'll make the introduction. Dana nodded once. Understood. The seatbelt sign chimed on again as the aircraft hit a patch of turbulence. The cabin shook lightly, glasses rattling in their holders. Adrienne's hand steadied his water without thinking. Samantha's voice came over the PA, instructing passengers to remain seated. Her tone was firm, but there was an edge under it now, a tightness that betrayed the stress she was under. When the ride smoothed out, the service resumed, but the tension didn't lift. Paul walked the aisle again, slower this time, his eyes scanning not for security risks, but for shifts in the cabin's mood. His glance slid past Adrienne's row, catching Dana's face for just a moment. Something in his expression flickered recognition, maybe or the awareness that her presence changed things. Adrian waited until Paul had moved on before speaking again. They'll be wondering who you are by now. Dana allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Let them wonder. The rest of the flight unfolded in a strange stillness. The conversations were quieter, the laughter muted. Passengers seemed to sense that something was playing out beneath the surface, even if they didn't know what it was. A few kept sneaking glances toward Adrienne's seat as though expecting a scene. Instead, he stayed calm, his presence steady. That was the point, to let the pressure build, to let the crew feel the weight of what they'd set in motion without any grand gesture from him. 2 hours out from New York, Adrienne's phone buzzed again. This time, the message was even shorter. Contact in place at JFK. Arrival arrangements confirmed. He locked the screen without reaction, but the information settled like a stone in his mind. The next phase was ready. Dana noticed the flicker of focus in his eyes. Good news, she asked. Necessary news, Adrian replied. From the galley. Samantha called Paul over. They spoke in hushed tones, their backs to the cabin. Dana's gaze followed them. They're trying to get ahead of this. They're already behind, Adrian said. As the minutes ticked by, the light outside shifted from the pale brightness of midday to the warmer tones of late afternoon. Through the oval window, the first hints of the East Coast began to take shape. Rivers winding through fields, clusters of buildings catching the sun. Dana gathered her bag and slid it neatly under her seat. When we land, I'll follow your lead. You'll have a front row seat, Adrian said. The seatbelt sign lit up again for descent. The captain's voice came over the PA, smooth but formal, announcing their approach to JF Cole. The cabin crew moved methodically through the final checks, but their focus was split. Every now and then, Adrian caught Samantha glancing toward him, her mouth set in a thin line. The hum of the engines changed pitch as they began their descent. The ground rose slowly in the windows. Dana's expression was calm, but her eyes were sharp. Ready. Adrian's posture didn't change, but his mind was already at the gate, already in the meeting that would follow. Whatever happened next, it would not be contained in the narrow walls of this aircraft. The witnesses were in place. The record was complete, and the people waiting on the ground had already been briefed. The landing gear thumped into place, and the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The landing was smooth, but the atmosphere inside the cabin was anything but. The moment the wheels touched the runway, a ripple of tension seemed to move through the crew. They were going through the motions announcements, safety reminders, yet their voices carried a tightness that every attentive passenger could hear. Adrian stayed seated as the aircraft rolled toward the gate. He could feel Dana's steady presence just behind him, her calm mirroring his own. Outside the window, the late afternoon lights slanted across the tarmac, glinting off the wings of neighboring aircraft. The engines wound down to a low growl as they reached the jet bridge. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and passengers began the familiar choreography of standing, stretching, and reaching for overhead bags. The narrow aisle filled with the shuffle of bodies and the rustle of coats. Adrian didn't move. Instead, he watched Samantha, who was stationed at the forward door.